The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the elm trees, turning the lawns of Lady Dunstable's estate into a dappled patchwork of gold and green. It was one of those early summer evenings in St. Mary Mead, when the air itself seemed to promise civility and good company. The annual garden party, hosted with precision and an abundance of cucumber sandwiches, was the highlight of the season. Everyone who mattered, or thought they did, was in attendance. The guests moved in small clusters, balancing china teacups and the occasional glass of sherry. Conversation flowed as smoothly as the breeze across the roses, all pleasant chatter about local church matters, gardening triumphs and the vexing problem of rising butter prices. It was, in short, an entirely ordinary village event, until Mrs. Felicity Wincombe arrived. She was a woman whose very presence carried with it the faint chill of scandal. Once beautiful and still striking in her early 40s, Mrs. Wincombe had a reputation that preceded her wherever she went. She was twice widowed, thrice remarried, and, most unsettling of all, every one of her 5 husbands had died on the very night of their wedding. The villagers, of course, had their theories. Poison, whispered some. An old family curse, muttered others with dramatic relish. Yet nothing had ever been proven, and Mrs. Wincombe carried herself with a serene dignity that defied the darker speculations. Today she wore a pale lavender gown, her wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow that made her expression unreadable. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with a plate of sponge cake upon her lap, observed the undercurrent ripple through the crowd as the widow bride took her place among them. Though she never gave the impression of eavesdropping, her sharp blue eyes missed little. The arching of Lady Dunstable's brows, the way Reverend Hewitt's wife leaned closer to whisper something urgent, the quick exchange of knowing glances. Between the 2 spinsters from the post office, conversation, once lively, now faltered into cautious politeness. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. It was only when Colonel Faraday, red-faced and jovial from the heat and the sherry, declared, in a booming voice, "By Jove, Felicity, one might almost think you collect husbands like some women collect china," that the tension broke. The laughter that followed was brittle, forced and entirely without mirth. Mrs. Wincombe smiled faintly, but her eyes did not smile with her. Miss Marple, without looking up from her cake, murmured something soft to no, one in particular. People are seldom kind when they are afraid. It was an odd remark, easily overlooked in the rustle of parasols and polite coughs. Yet for those who listened closely, it was a foreshadowing. For within a fortnight, St. Mary Mead would no longer be talking of cucumber sandwiches or the roses. Instead, the village would be consumed by another death, one that drew all eyes back to the mysterious bride who had already watched 5 husbands die. The news of Sir Geoffrey Wincombe's sudden death did not arrive with any fanfare. It drifted through the village in the way all shocking news does, carried on lowered voices and half-whispered confidences, so that by the time the church bells struck 9 that morning, every soul in St. Mary Mead knew the tale. The doctor had called it a heart seizure, quick and final, but the villagers were not so easily satisfied. It was the 6th time misfortune had claimed a husband of Felicity Wincombe, and though Sir Geoffrey had lived beyond his wedding night, the shadow of the other 5 still loomed over him. A pattern so stark, so extraordinary, could not be ignored. At the post office, Miss Hartnell and her sister Miss Cram were already holding court by mid-morning, each eager to be the first to declare what everyone else dared only to hint at. They spoke with the righteous certainty of women who believed their observations to be superior to those of the police or the doctor. "You may call it coincidence if you wish," Miss Hartnell declared, her umbrella tapping sharply on the counter. "But 6 men do not die so conveniently one after the other without reason. It's as clear as the nose on my face." Her sister nodded, hat bobbing as she added that some women were born with an ill fate about them, that Felicity Wincombe had the look of a woman cursed, though whether by nature or by her own hand she could not say. The postmaster, a mild fellow, who disliked disputes, made vague sounds of agreement while carefully avoiding any statement that might be repeated. Their words, of course, did not stay confined to the post office. Within an hour Mrs. Hewitt had repeated them in the vicarage drawing-room while serving her husband his tea. She declared the whole business sinister, though she struggled between proper Christian pity for the widow and a private sense that Pity was wasted on a woman so persistently unlucky in marriage. Reverend Hewitt, wishing to keep his household free of speculation, reminded her that gossip was unbecoming and that misfortune was not proof of wickedness. But his words were weak, and even he could not shake a faint unease. 6 dead husbands were difficult for even the most charitable imagination to dismiss. By afternoon, the talk had moved to the Blue Boar Inn, where farmers, shopkeepers, and retired gentlemen gathered in the snug bar. Colonel Faraday, with his booming voice and flushed cheeks, declared that Geoffrey Wickham must have had enemies. A man in business, particularly one of means, was bound to make them, and sooner or later such matters caught up. Others countered that no enemy would be so tidy, leaving no mark, no forced window, no hint of struggle. Geoffrey Wickham had been found in his chair, spectacles on the desk beside him, as though death had stepped quietly into the room and laid a hand upon his heart. "No," the men murmured. "It was not enemies. It was Felicity herself, the spider at the center of the web, and each husband had wandered too close to her velvet threads." Meanwhile, in her neat garden on the edge of the village, Miss Jane Marple clipped dead roses from their stems and listened to Mrs. Price Ridley's breathless account. Mrs. Price Ridley, delighted to be the first to bring the tale, had framed it with ominous detail, lowering her voice in the manner of those who think tragedy demands theatrics. Miss Marple listened politely, her eyes on her roses, her mind elsewhere. She did not believe in curses, nor in fateful shadows that claimed lives in some Gothic pattern. She believed in people, and people she knew from long experience could be infinitely more destructive than any imagined fate. 6 husbands dead might be coincidence, yes, but it was a coincidence of a kind she had rarely seen. That evening, Wickham House stood dark behind its gates. Felicity Wickham sat alone in her drawing-room. The servants dismissed early. She did not care for their looks, the mixture of pity and suspicion that flickered across their faces when they thought she could not see. The mirror above the mantel showed her calm, untroubled, even regal, yet her hands twisted together in her lap, as if compelled by some inner agitation. She had buried 5 husbands before Geoffrey, endured the stares and whispers of neighbors, and each time she had emerged, composed, untouchable. But this 6th death was different. The village no longer whispered, it gossiped openly. The police no longer offered condolences, they asked questions. And Felicity Wickham knew that even a composed smile could not silence doubt forever. The very next day, Inspector Cray arrived from the county constabulary. A tall man with a clipped moustache and a manner as brisk as a November wind, he carried with him the air of authority and suspicion. He did not bother with pleasantries when ushered into Felicity's drawing-room. He informed her with stiff politeness that while Sir Geoffrey's death appeared natural, the peculiar history of her marriages required his attention. She listened without interruption, her pale hands folded neatly in her lap. When he at last paused, she smiled faintly and asked whether he intended to accuse her of murdering her own husbands. He shifted, uneasy, and insisted that he accused her of nothing, but that patterns demanded explanation. "Patterns," she repeated softly, her eyes never leaving his. "Yes, Inspector, the world is full of them. Unfortunately, I cannot control those that fate lays at my feet. If you wish to charge me, then do so, otherwise kindly allow me to mourn in peace." Her words were firm, her tone icily calm. But Miss Marple, who later heard of the interview from the inspector himself, noted, with interest, his remark that her composure had faltered only once when his questions drifted toward the writing desk in the corner of the room. Her eyes had flicked toward it just for a moment, with something too quick, too sharp to be grief. By twilight, St. Mary Mead was alive with speculation. Windows glowed with lamplight, and behind curtains voices murmured of curses, poisons, secret affairs, hidden resentments. Some pitied Felicity, others condemned her, but all agreed that no one woman could suffer such misfortune without cause. Even those inclined to charity whispered their doubts when the door was closed. Miss Marple, seated by her own window with her knitting, let the talk pass through her mind as quietly as the thread through her fingers. She had lived long enough to know that human wickedness often wore a charming face, and that guilt was seldom obvious. Felicity Wincombe might be a black widow, as some declared, or she might be nothing more than the victim of cruel chance. But the truth, Miss Marple thought, would not be found in curses or in superstition. It would be found, as it always was, in the small and telling habits of human nature. Somewhere in the way people spoke, in the little gestures they made, in the contradictions of their stories, the pattern of truth was waiting to be noticed, and Miss Marple intended to notice it. The village did not rest after the funeral of Sir Geoffrey Wincombe. If anything, the undercurrent of speculation became more insistent, more pointed. Though the official verdict remained heart failure, no one in St. Mary Mead seemed content to let the matter lie. People carried their questions like bundles under their arms, unable to put them down. And wherever 2 or 3 villagers gathered, whether at the greengrocer's or outside the church gates, the subject was always the same: Felicity Wincombe, her husband's, and the dark string of deaths that followed her like shadows. Miss Marple, in her customary way, did not insert herself into these conversations. She was too shrewd to be caught up in the loudest theories, the ones shouted with conviction, but built on very little. Instead, she listened. At the grocer's, she heard Mrs. Price Ridley insist that Geoffrey Wincombe had been contemplating altering his will only a fortnight before his death. At the churchyard, she overheard Colonel Faraday mutter that Geoffrey had been in robust health, the kind of man who took his exercise daily and never missed a hunt. At the inn, she caught a whisper about a quarrel overheard between Geoffrey and his stepson, though no one could say what it had been about. Miss Marple tucked each remark away in her mind like scraps of fabric, knowing that eventually they might be stitched into a pattern. She had the advantage, too, of being regarded as a harmless old lady, a figure who asked seemingly innocent questions about roses or recipes or the weather. Few realized that in answering her, they revealed much more than they intended. Human Nature, Miss Marple often thought, was a book that most people never learned to read properly. But she had spent a lifetime studying its pages. It was on one of her afternoon walks, basket in hand, that she encountered Inspector Cray again. He had the look of a man pressed between duty and frustration, for the case was thin as mist. He admitted as much when Miss Marple, with her gentle manner, asked how his work was proceeding. "There is nothing to proceed with," he confessed, tugging irritably at his moustache. "A man dies in his own home, alone. No sign of struggle, no trace of poison, no evidence of interference. And yet half the county seems determined to make a murder of it." Miss Marple gave a small nod, her eyes thoughtful. "People are very observant, Inspector, though not always in the ways that matter. They notice patterns, and patterns can be very persuasive. But sometimes what looks like a pattern is only a trick of the light, and sometimes it is precisely what it seems to be." She let the words hang, knitting them with her own soft smile, and before the inspector could press her further, she moved along with her basket of groceries. Later that same day, Miss Marple was invited to tea at the home of Mrs. Hewitt, who was eager to share what she called a dreadful confidence. The vicar's wife leaned forward, eyes bright with excitement under the guise of solemnity, and whispered that Felicity Wincombe had been seen burning papers in her drawing-room fireplace the very night of Sir Geoffrey's death. The maid, so Mrs. Hewitt declared, had caught sight of it while fetching coal for the scuttle. "What woman just widowed thinks first to destroy papers?" Mrs. Hewitt concluded. "It is not natural, Jane, not natural at all." Miss Marple smiled politely and said nothing. But she remembered the inspector's remark about Felicity's glance at the writing desk, a small detail, easily missed, yet one that now appeared to carry more weight. What papers could need burning in the middle of the night? And why had Felicity been so quick to ensure they vanished? In the days that followed, Miss Marple took quiet note of the widow's movements. Felicity Wincombe did not seclude herself as some might have expected. She attended church, where she sat in her usual pew, her back straight, her head held high. She walked in the village lanes, pausing to greet those who would greet her, though many a villager quickly found an excuse to be elsewhere, and she entertained visitors at Wincombe House, though never in groups, always one by one, as if she preferred her conversations private. It was during one of these outings that Miss Marple observed a curious encounter between Felicity and a young man near the market square. He was a striking fellow, tall, fair-haired, with the restless energy of youth. She recognized him at once as Robert Wincombe, Geoffrey's son by his first marriage. He had returned to the village after the funeral, his presence a reminder that Geoffrey's estate was not a simple matter. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively on a bench with her knitting, watched as Felicity spoke to him in low tones. His expression shifted between anger and resentment, and at one moment he raised his hand as though in protest before checking himself. Felicity, by contrast, remained composed, her face a mask of calm. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, before he stalked away, his shoulders rigid, leaving her standing in the street with her parasol at her side. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple asked a passing question of Mrs. Price Ridley, who was always glad to answer. Robert Wincombe, she was told, had been left very little in his father's will, most of the estate having gone to Felicity. There had been talk of resentment even before the marriage, and Robert, it was said, had never forgiven his stepmother for what he called her grasping ways. To some villagers he now appeared a likely suspect, though suspicion was a commodity freely shared in St. Mary Mead, and no one yet agreed on who should bear the most of it. Miss Marple tucked the matter into her mind with the others. Resentment over money, the burning of papers, the widow's unshakable composure, all threads that might yet connect. But she knew better than to draw conclusions too soon. Human beings, she had found, were never so simple as their neighbors believed them to be. That evening she sat with her knitting by the fire, the needles clicking softly while she thought. A curious thing, she reflected, how tragedy seemed to follow Felicity Wincombe, yet no clear evidence ever emerged. The first, husband had died of what was called a stroke, the second of food poisoning. The third had drowned in his bath, the fourth had fallen from his horse, and the fifth had suffered what was deemed a sudden fever, and now the sixth, a heart seizure. Each death with its own explanation, each plausible when taken alone, but together forming a chain too neat, too unbroken. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she counted her stitches. It reminded her of Mrs. Nichols, the dressmaker's niece, who had once contrived to borrow money from 5 separate ladies in the parish by telling each one a slightly different story of hardship. Each story alone had seemed reasonable, but the pattern betrayed her. Felicity Wincombe's husbands, she thought, might not be so different. 1 tragedy may be chance, 2 coincidence, but 6 demanded explanation. Still, Miss Marple knew that the answer, when it came, would not be found in grand theories or dramatic gestures. It would be tucked in some overlooked detail, some small habit or telling word. People gave themselves away, always, if one only listened long enough, and so she resolved to keep listening, to keep watching, until the truth revealed itself. The village was not long in deciding where suspicion should fall. It is always more comforting, after all, to have a face to point to than to live with the uncertainty of not knowing. Within a week of Sir Geoffrey Wincombe's funeral, talk had shifted from the mysterious widow herself to those around her, and the names most often whispered were Robert Wincombe, Geoffrey's only son, and a woman by the name of Clara Harwood, who had once been very close to Geoffrey indeed. Robert's presence in the village was enough to set tongues wagging. He was a handsome man, but there was a restlessness about him, an impatience that made even his good looks unsettling. The villagers remembered his temper as a boy, his sharp words and quick fists when things did not go his way. He had left for London to work in finance, or so the story went, but little was ever said of his successes there. Now, back in St. Mary Mead, he seemed restless, prowling the lanes with long strides as though the quiet fields and hedgerows were a cage too small for him. He was seen often enough at the Blue Boar, and more than once he drank too freely. Colonel Faraday, never one to miss the chance of a dramatic statement, declared that Robert had argued openly with his father in the weeks before Geoffrey's death. Money, of course, the colonel announced to an attentive circle one evening. The lad felt cheated, cut out of what he thought was his due. I heard it myself down in the High Street. Geoffrey told him to make his own way in the world. that he had no intention of supporting a grown man's extravagance. Robert looked ready to strike him. It wouldn't surprise me if he took matters into his own hands. This sentiment found fertile ground in the village imagination. Robert became, in the minds of many, the perfect suspect, angry, disinherited, and with a temperament too hot to disguise it. That no evidence connected him to his father's death seemed to matter little. People were willing to fill in the gaps themselves, but there was another figure woven into the murmurs of suspicion, and she was Clara Harwood, a woman of gentle manner and soft voice, who had, some years earlier, been a companion of Lady Dunstable. Clara had known Geoffrey Wickham well, too well according to some. She had been seen walking with him along the river path, had shared more than one quiet conversation in corners at gatherings, nothing improper, of course, but enough to give rise to talk. And then, quite suddenly, she had removed herself from his company altogether. When Geoffrey married Felicity, Clara vanished from the village for a time, only to return a few months before his death. Now villagers whispered that she had not been as detached from Geoffrey as she had appeared. Some claimed that she had once hoped to marry him herself, others that she had been cruelly discarded in favor of Felicity. Either way, resentment was the suggested motive, and Clara, though mild in demeanor, became a shadowy figure in the retelling of events. Inspector Cray, for his part, was not slow to take an interest in Robert Wickham. A son at odds with his father, a man with a grievance over inheritance, it was a simple and satisfying explanation. He questioned Robert at length, though the young man responded with a kind of contemptuous defiance. "I had no need to poison my father," he said more than once. "His death robbed me of any chance of persuading him to change his mind. I may not have loved him, but I am not fool enough to hasten my own ruin." The inspector pressed further, but nothing tangible emerged. Robert had been seen that night at the Blue Boar, in company until well after Geoffrey had been found. There was no opportunity for him to have slipped away unnoticed, no trace of anything suspicious upon him. Yet the inspector remained dissatisfied, for the motive was too strong to ignore, and he hinted broadly in conversations that he would not be surprised if proof eventually came to light. Miss Marple, hearing these things in the ordinary course of village chatter, was not convinced. Motives, she knew, were plentiful in life. People often had reasons to hate, to resent, to envy, but motives alone did not make murderers. She remembered well the case of young Mr. Harding years ago, when everyone believed he had stolen a sum of money from the church collection box. His debts were well known, his need obvious, and yet in the end it had been the churchwarden himself, a man no one suspected, who had pocketed the coins. Human nature was seldom so obliging as to match appearances. It was at this time that Miss Marple herself observed Clara Harwood walking across the green, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the ground. She looked every inch the picture of sorrow and gentleness, and Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes, thought she saw not guilt, but fear. Fear of being drawn into the story, fear of her name being spoken in the same breath as scandal. It was an expression Miss Marple had seen before, in those who had something to conceal, though what that something was could not yet be guessed. The villagers, however, thrived on their speculation. Some leaned toward Robert as the culprit, others toward Clara, and still others clung stubbornly to the idea that Felicity herself was the only constant in all the deaths, and must therefore be guilty. The air in St. Mary Mead grew thick with half-truths and imaginings, and those who had known one another all their lives now eyed each other with faint suspicion, for when murder is suspected, no one feels entirely innocent. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained quiet. She listened to the tales, to the embellishments, to the little contradictions that people did not notice in their eagerness to speak. She filed them away as carefully as she folded her linen, waiting for the moment when the pattern would become clear. For the truth, she was certain, would not be found in the obvious suspects, nor in the loudest voices, but in the small and telling details overlooked by others. One evening, as she sat knitting by her fire, she reflected upon Robert Wickham's anger. Anger, yes, but anger alone did not kill. She thought too of Clara Harwood's anxious eyes, of Felicity's composure, of the inspector's frustration. Somewhere among them lay the truth, and Miss Marple, with her patient mind, was content to let it come to her in its own time. She knew the ways of people, and she knew that sooner or later one of them would betray themselves, not with grand confessions or dramatic acts, but with some small slip, some human weakness they could not quite conceal. And when the days that followed were filled with a curious mixture of stillness and unease. The village appeared unchanged. The milk was delivered, the children trailed reluctantly to school, and the shopkeepers swept their thresholds with the same ritual care. Yet beneath the quiet, there lingered a restless current of suspicion and dread. It was as if the death of Sir Geoffrey Wickham had unfastened something long secured, a sense that evil, once loosed, might strike again without warning. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the subtle alterations in her neighbours. Mrs. Price, who had always been forthright in her opinions, now spoke in hushed tones and crossed herself when passing the Wickham house. Young Lydia Faraday, usually lively and irrepressible, grew pale and distracted, glancing behind her as though expecting some unseen presence. Even the vicar, a man of firm principle, seemed oddly subdued, his sermons dwelling longer on the themes of sin and retribution. It was within this atmosphere of quiet dread that the smallest of things took on significance. A remark, half heard, a movement barely registered, a trifle that others dismissed. These were the things that Miss Marple cherished. She had lived long enough to know that the world's great truths often revealed themselves not in bold gestures, but in the tiniest slips of human nature. It was on a damp afternoon, as the clouds hung low over the village, that she found her first true clue. She had taken it into her head to pay a call upon Mrs. Harwood, Clara's mother, who was known to suffer from rheumatism and enjoyed company in her lonely hours. The Harwood cottage was a modest one, with a low roof and ivy climbing over its front wall. Miss Marple brought a jar of her blackcurrant jam, which was received with grateful hands, and soon found herself seated by the hearth with a cup of weak tea before her. Clara herself was present, quiet and withdrawn, her hands busy with mending. She looked weary, as though sleep had not been her friend for many nights. Mrs. Harwood, meanwhile, was talkative, delighted to have company, and quite ready to air her opinions. She spoke of the weather, of her neighbours' chickens, of the rising cost of coal, and then inevitably of Sir Geoffrey's death. "It's a dreadful thing, Miss Marple," she said, shaking her head. "And poor Clara here, dragged into the gossip, though she's no more to do with it than the cat on the doorstep. People do love to talk. But I will say this," and here she leaned closer, lowering her voice in a conspiratorial whisper, "that house has never been right since Felicity came into it. A bad spirit she has, mark my words. Sweet as honey to your face, but there's something cold in her eyes. Geoffrey was a fool to put aside. Well, never mind that." Clara's hand paused on her mending, a tremor passing over her face. Miss Marple saw it at once, though she pretended not to notice. She only sipped her tea and murmured something sympathetic. It was as she set down her cup that she noticed a curious object upon the side table beside Clara's chair. A little silver case of the sort used to carry powders or tablets. It was finely made, engraved with a pattern of leaves, and had about it the faint tarnish of frequent handling. Clara, seeing her glance, moved it almost unconsciously, slipping it into the folds of her work-basket. He was seen often enough at the Blue Boar, and more than once he drank too freely. Colonel Faraday, never one to miss the chance of a dramatic statement, declared that Robert had argued openly with his father in the weeks before Geoffrey's death. "Money, of course," the colonel announced to an attentive circle one evening. "The lad felt cheated, cut out of what he thought was his due. I heard it myself down in the High Street. Geoffrey told him to make his own way in the world, that he had no intention of supporting a grown man's extravagance. Robert looked ready to strike him. It wouldn't surprise me if he took matters into his own hands." This sentiment found fertile ground in the village imagination. Robert became, in the minds of many, the perfect suspect, angry, disinherited, and with a temperament too hot to disguise it. That no evidence connected him to his father's death seemed to matter little. People were willing to fill in the gaps themselves. But there was a... Miss Marple asked nothing, but her mind began to stir. She had seen a case very like it once before, many years ago, when a young man in the village had suffered from heart trouble and carried digitalis tablets in just such a container. The resemblance was striking, and Miss Marple, whose memory for detail was unfailingly sharp, stored the observation away with quiet satisfaction. On her walk home, she considered what she had seen. The presence of such a case suggested medicine, perhaps even something dangerous if misused. And yet Clara had seemed reluctant to leave it in sight, concealing it with an almost guilty haste. Was it merely a habit born of privacy, or was there something more? The inspector, she knew, would not think twice about it. Men in authority rarely troubled themselves with trifles, but Miss Marple knew better. That evening she sat by her fire, her knitting untouched, turning the matter over in her mind. If Clara carried medicine, it could mean one of several things. She might be unwell herself, though she looked in fair health. She might be caring for her mother, who was certainly frail. Or, and here Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful, the tablets might have found their way into other hands, hands that had reason to see Geoffrey Wincombe dead. It was a slender thread, to be sure, but Miss Marple had seen slender threads unravel great knots before. Meanwhile, suspicion continued to swirl about Robert Wincombe. Inspector Cray returned to the village inn, questioning again those who had seen him that evening. Robert himself grew increasingly irritable under the scrutiny, lashing out at what he called the inspector's country pettiness. He spoke openly of leaving St. Mary Mead, of returning to London and putting the entire wretched business behind him. Such threats only serve to deepen suspicion, for those who flee are always thought to have something to hide. Felicity, by contrast, remained calm. Too calm, some thought. She accepted condolences with composure, her face pale but serene, her voice steady. She wore no heavy veil, no dramatic display of mourning. Instead, she spoke softly of Geoffrey's kindness, of her grief, though there was something oddly detached in her manner. The villagers were divided. Some declared her cold-hearted, a woman of stone. Others, less critical, saw it as strength, the dignity of one who bore her sorrow without fuss. Miss Marple, watching her at a distance, noted the absence of spontaneity. Felicity's sorrow seemed rehearsed, her words chosen with care, as though she were performing grief rather than living it. Yet Miss Marple did not rush to judgment. Appearances, she knew, were as treacherous as quicksand. The true significance of her afternoon with Clara Harwood came clear the next morning, when Miss Marple received a visit from young Lydia Faraday. The girl was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She sat trembling in Miss Marple's parlour, her hands twisting in her lap, and whispered, "I think I've seen something I oughtn't, Miss Marple. Something about that lady, about Mrs. Wincombe." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and listened, her expression gentle, encouraging. Lydia spoke of passing the Wincombe house late in the evening on her way back from a friend's. She had glimpsed through the lighted window Felicity standing by the writing desk. In her hand was a small silver case, one that gleamed in the lamplight, its pattern of leaves catching Lydia's eye. Miss Marple felt her breath still for a moment, though her face betrayed nothing. A silver case, so very like the one she had seen at Clara Harwood's cottage. 2 cases, perhaps, or only one. And if it were the same, how had it travelled from Clara's basket to Felicity's hand? She soothed Lydia's fears, assuring her she had done right to speak, and sent her home, with a few kind words. But when the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat long in thought. Here was a thread indeed, and it seemed already to be drawing others toward it. A small, overlooked trifle, a silver case, hardly worth a second glance. And yet Miss Marple knew in her heart that such trifles were often the key to everything. The clue was not yet proof, nor did it yet form a picture she could present to Inspector Cray. But it was enough. Enough to keep her eyes fixed more keenly on Clara Harwood and Felicity Wincombe, and enough to tell her that Robert Wincombe's temper and grievances were, perhaps, nothing more than a convenient distraction. For the first time since Geoffrey's death, Miss Marple felt that the darkness which had settled over the village might be pierced. Not banished, not yet, but pierced faintly by the glimmer of truth. And with patience she knew that glimmer would grow. That moment came, she would be ready. The rain had set in steady and unyielding, drumming against the tiled roofs of St. Mary Mead and turning the lanes to dark rivulets of mud. It was the sort of weather that discouraged visitors and left the village in a sullen hush. Yet within parlours and kitchens tongues wagged all the more eagerly. The walls that kept out the rain could not keep out the gossip, and the story of Sir Geoffrey Wincombe's death had already taken on the shape of legend. Miss Marple, who never trusted legends, busied herself that morning with her correspondence. Her neat, old-fashioned handwriting filled a letter to her nephew Raymond, though her mind was only half on the task. She was thinking of silver cases, of trembling girls, of Felicity Wincombe's carefully measured sorrow. And, above all, she was thinking of Clara Harwood. The Harwood girl had the look of one burdened not merely by grief or fear, but by knowledge she could not, or dared not, share. Miss Marple knew that look. She had seen it on the faces of village children who had broken a window and kept silent, on the lips of women who knew of their husbands' indiscretions but preferred to pretend otherwise. Knowledge was a weight, and Clara's shoulders were stooped beneath it. Her suspicions were given form later that day when she met Colonel Faraday outside the post office. The colonel, always too eager to pass along tidings, lowered his voice and confided, "You'll never guess, Miss Marple, what I've heard. Old Mrs. Harwood let something slip to Mrs. Price. You know how she goes on when her rheumatism flares. It seems Geoffrey Wincombe wasn't the first man in Clara's life. There was some trouble. Years ago, before Felicity ever came into the picture." Miss Marple made a small sound of polite surprise, though she felt none. There was always trouble. If one looked far enough back. The colonel leaned closer. "A young fellow, some sort of clerk or secretary, died suddenly, as I recall. Heart failure, they said. Tragic business, swept under the rug. But you see what I mean, eh? 2 deaths, connected to the same young lady. That sort of thing leaves a mark." She listened, nodding gently while her mind worked. If Clara had been touched once by scandal, it might explain her reticence now. A mother would do much to shield her daughter from renewed whispers. And Felicity Wincombe, cool and calculating, might find such past shadows useful to divert attention from herself. That evening, Miss Marple sought out an old ally in the village, the solicitor, Mr. Henderson, her grave man with iron-grey hair, who had kept records for half a century. Over tea in his dim study, she inquired, in her innocently circuitous way, about Clara Harwood's youth. Mr. Henderson, accustomed to her gentle probes, was not surprised. "Yes," he said slowly, "there was such an affair. About 8 years past. Clara had been engaged, though it was never widely acknowledged. A young man named Philip Cawthorne. He was in the employ of a shipping firm in London. Came down here often enough. Died on a visit, in fact. Poor fellow collapsed after supper, one evening. They called it his heart. He'd had a weakness since boyhood. The doctor was quite firm about it." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the solicitor's dusty bookshelves. "And yet," she said softly, "these weaknesses do not usually surprise the sufferer, do they? He must have known his own condition." "One would think so," Mr. Henderson agreed, but the Harwoods were discreet. Clara took it hard, though she spoke little of it. Afterward she seemed altered, quieter, more withdrawn. A pity. She was a lively girl before. Miss Marple thanked him and made her way home through the drizzle, her umbrella a frail defence against the weather. She thought of Philip Cawthorne struck down at supper, and of Geoffrey Wincombe felled after his own evening meal. 2 deaths, years apart, but joined by an echo too strong to ignore. A coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps not. The following day, Inspector Cray visited the village once more. His presence, with its air of stern authority, unsettled the locals. He summoned Robert Wincombe to the inn for further questioning, pressing him on his quarrels with his brother. Robert, flushed and angry, protested his innocence, declaring that Geoffrey's death was nothing to do with him. His impatience only served to deepen the inspector's doubts, though Miss Marple, listening quietly at the edge of the room, noted something else. Robert's fury was too unguarded, too loud. True guilt, in her experience, rarely showed itself so openly. Those who had much to hide were careful with their tempers, cultivating an appearance of calm. Robert Wincombe was no actor. His words rang too raw, his gestures too clumsy. He might be many things, a wastrel, a scoundrel, but Miss Marple suspected he was no murderer. It was later that afternoon, while returning from the grocer's, that Miss Marple's steps led her past the churchyard. There she encountered Lydia Faraday again, loitering near the lich gate, her face pale against the grey stones. The girl seemed startled to see her, then quickly relieved. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "I keep thinking of what I told you, about the silver case. I've tried to put it from my mind, but I can't. It feels important. And yet if I speak of it to the inspector, he'll laugh. He'll say it was nothing." Miss Marple patted her arm kindly. "Men in authority, my dear, are often too fond of dismissing what they cannot see the use of. But you are quite right to remember, small things matter. In my experience, they matter most of all." Lydia hesitated, then whispered, Do you think Mrs. Wincombe had anything to do with it? She frightens me sometimes. She looks at one as though she can see straight through to one's thoughts." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice was grave. "It is possible, child, to look at people and see nothing at all. And it is also possible to look at them and see too much. But the truth hides itself very carefully." As she made her way home, Miss Marple pieced together the fragments. Geoffrey Wincombe's death bore a strange resemblance to the earlier tragedy of Philip Cawthorne. Clara's silver case had found its way into Felicity's hands. Lydia's frightened testimony added weight to her suspicions, and always there was Felicity herself, calm and untouchable, the eye of the storm. She recalled Colonel Faraday's careless jest at the garden party about Felicity collecting husbands as others collected china. The words, crude though they were, carried a curious echo, for Felicity had indeed collected husbands, and each one had slipped away in death. The village called it a curse, but Miss Marple knew better. Curses were merely convenient names for what people did not wish to explain. That night, as the rain slackened and the wind rattled the shutters, Miss Marple sat with her knitting needles clicking softly. She had the sense that the past was not merely casting shadows, but actively reaching into the present. Philip Cawthorne's sudden death, Clara's hidden grief, Felicity Wincombe's long trail of husbands, all were threads in the same web. The trick would be to see how they were knotted and who had tied them, for if there was one thing Miss Marple had learned, it was that people never truly escaped their past. The mistakes of youth, the secrets buried with time, they always resurfaced sooner or later, demanding to be reckoned with. And in St. Mary Mead, she thought, that reckoning had already begun. The storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean, the sky washed pale as porcelain. Yet for all the brightness of the morning, the village carried with it a sense of strain, like a violin string pulled too tight. People smiled a little too quickly, laughed a little too loudly as though to drive away the unease that lingered in every corner. Death, once it came, never left St. Mary Mead entirely. It hovered, invisible yet persistent, like the faint smell of smoke in a room long after the fire had burned out. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual that day, unsettled by dreams she could not quite recall. She took her tea at the window, watching the street awaken. The milk cart rattled by, a child trudged off to school, and a dog nosed at the hedge. All perfectly ordinary, yet she felt in her bones that something was about to shift. The pattern of human life had a rhythm, and she had lived long enough to sense when it faltered. By mid-morning, her instincts were confirmed. Word arrived at the post office, carried by a breathless errand boy. Clara Harwood was missing. At first, people dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Clara was often quiet, inclined to solitary walks, and it was supposed she had gone to the woods or perhaps into the next village. But when she did not return by noon, and when her mother, wringing her hands and weeping, declared she had left the house without a word, the whispers began. Miss Marple, listening to the talk that rose and spread like wildfire, kept her expression calm. A disappearance following so soon upon a death was never mere chance. Clara Harwood, already shadowed by her past and by the silver case Miss Marple had noticed, had become the fulcrum of the mystery. Now she was gone, and with her went answers that might never be spoken. Inspector Cray was summoned at once. He descended upon the Harwood cottage with his usual air of authority, sending constables to search the lanes and fields. Villagers gathered, in anxious clusters, offering suggestions and theories. Some whispered that Clara had fled in fear of suspicion. Others hinted she had followed her late fiancé into despair. A few, darker still, suggested she had been silenced. Miss Marple visited the Harwoods that afternoon, carrying a basket of bread and soup under the pretense of kindness. She found Mrs. Harwood nearly beside herself, pacing the parlour with red-rimmed eyes. "She's a good girl, Miss Marple, a good girl," she cried. "She would never run away without telling me. Something's happened, I know it has. Oh, why must they always suspect her when she's done nothing wrong?" Miss Marple soothed her gently, offering small comforts, while her sharp eyes wandered about the room. She noted the basket where the silver case had once been, empty now. She asked no questions, but the absence spoke volumes. The following day brought the discovery that set the village into uproar. Clara's shawl, the one she had worn the evening before, was found snagged on a thorn bush near the edge of the woods. Beneath it, trampled into the damp earth, were the impressions of hurried footsteps. 2 sets side by side, one lighter and one heavier. A broken branch nearby suggested a struggle. The inspector wasted no time in drawing conclusions. "Abduction," he declared. "Plain as day. The girl's been taken. Perhaps worse." He ordered an extensive search of the woods, and for hours men combed the undergrowth with lanterns and dogs. But as the sun set, nothing further was found. Clara had vanished, as though the earth itself had swallowed her. Theories bloomed like weeds. Some pointed at Robert Wincombe, who had quarrelled with his brother and had reason, so they said, to silence Clara if she knew something against him. Others turned to Felicity, whispering that she had orchestrated Clara's removal to protect her own secrets. A few, remembering the old story of Philip Cawthorne, muttered of curses and doom. Through it all, Miss Marple remained quiet, listening. She saw how people leapt to the most dramatic conclusions, how fear made them careless with logic. She remembered Lydia Faraday's frightened testimony about the silver case in Felicity's hand. She remembered, too, the way Clara had hidden it when she saw Miss Marple's gaze upon it. 2 women, 1 object and now 1 missing. The pieces were shifting but not yet fitting. That evening, as she returned from the Harwoods, she passed Felicity Wincombe in the lane. The widow was dressed impeccably in black, her veil drawn, her step unhurried. She greeted Miss Marple with a faint, distant smile. "A dreadful business about poor Clara," she said softly. "One wonders what compels people to run away from their troubles. But then some natures are weak. They cannot endure hardship as others do." Her tone was calm, almost pitying, but Miss Marple detected the faintest note of satisfaction beneath it, like a musician striking a discordant chord. In an otherwise sweet melody, she replied only with a murmur of agreement, but her mind filed the impression away. Later that night, long after lamps had been lit and shutters drawn, a shout rang through the village. A farmhand returning late had found something by the mill pond. Clara Harwood's body, lying half submerged in the reeds. The news spread with terrible swiftness. By dawn, the whole of St. Mary Mead was gathered in the square, speaking in hushed, horrified voices. Clara, the quiet girl, the unlucky, one was dead. Whether by her own hand or another's, no one could yet say. The inspector leaned toward the latter. The broken branch, the marks of struggle, these spoke of violence. Miss Marple, hearing the whispers, felt no shock, only a deepening of her quiet resolve. Death had come again, as she had known it would. The pattern of the mystery had shifted. But it had not vanished. Clara's death was not an end, but a continuation, a second act in a play whose conclusion was still veiled. At the inquest, the doctor confirmed drowning as the cause, but the bruises on Clara's arms suggested restraint. She had not fallen nor stumbled. Someone had led her or forced her into the water. The inspector spoke sternly of foul play, promising to find the culprit. Yet even as he addressed the gathered villagers, Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flickered toward Robert Wincombe, and how the crowd followed that gaze with nods and mutters. It was too neat, too simple. Robert, with his hot temper and sullenness, made a convenient scapegoat. But Miss Marple's mind returned again and again to the silver case, to Felicity's cool composure, and to the old story of Philip Cawthorne. That night, as she sat knitting by the fire, she recalled something her old friend Mrs. Bantry once said. "Murderers are like gardeners, Jane. They prune away what they cannot use." Clara, Miss Marple thought, had known something, or possessed something, that made her dangerous to someone. And now she was gone, pruned away with cold precision. The village would go on chattering, Inspector Cray would go on interrogating, and suspicion would go on shifting like the wind. But Miss Marple, quiet and determined, knew that the heart of the matter lay not in anger or quarrels, but in the subtleties of human nature. Pride, fear, love, jealousy. These were the true weapons, sharper than knives and deadlier than poisons. And, somewhere in the quiet folds of that knowledge, the truth was waiting. The morning after Clara Harwood's death, the village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a hush heavier than any storm. The streets were damp, the air thick with mist that clung to the hedgerows and trees like a grey veil. People moved about cautiously, avoiding one another's eyes, as though mere looks might betray unspoken suspicions. The church bells tolled for morning service, but even the steady rhythm of their pealing failed to lift the weight that had settled over the village. Miss Marple, who rose early as always, took her customary walk through the misty lanes, her basket swinging lightly from her arm. She greeted the occasional villager with a nod, though few returned it, their faces pale and drawn with worry. Her thoughts, however, were focused on the intricate weave of events that had brought St. Mary Mead to this uneasy stillness. Geoffrey Wincome's death, Clara Harwood's disappearance, the silver case, all were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to see with increasing clarity. The first stop of her walk was the Blue Boar, where Robert Wincome had been seen, almost nightly since his father's passing. The inn's warmth and smell of roasting meat offered a comfort to some, but Robert seemed anything but comforted. He sat alone, his hands clasped around a mug of tea, his gaze distant. Miss Marple approached quietly, seating herself across from him with a serene smile. "Good morning, Robert," she said softly. "I hope the day finds you a little more at ease." Robert started slightly, as if he had not expected the old lady to know of his presence, and then forced a smile. "I suppose," he said curtly, "though I find it hard to be at ease when the world seems determined to condemn me without evidence." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "People are quick to see what they wish to see, Robert, and they often overlook what they should notice. Tell me, have you thought of where Clara might have gone, or why she might have left so suddenly?" Robert's brow furrowed. "I don't know. She wouldn't speak to me about it. She seemed frightened of something, though I never understood what. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps everyone is looking for a reason where none exists." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unyielding, met his. "And yet people do not vanish for no reason. That is seldom the case, is it?" He shook his head, his lips pressed tightly together. There was a flicker in his expression, a subtle tremor of discomfort, small, almost invisible, but enough for Miss Marple to note. It was not the tremor of guilt, she decided, but of frustration. The frustration of a man who had been wrongly suspected, whose temper made him appear dangerous to those who did not understand him. Leaving Robert, she continued on to Wincome House. Felicity was in the drawing-room, seated beside the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up at Miss Marple with that same composed expression, as though no storm had ever touched her life. "Miss Marple," Felicity said, her voice soft and measured, "I trust you are well. I have been considering the events of the past days, and I am afraid this village is becoming unruly. So many theories, so many accusations, it is exhausting." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is the nature of people to seek explanations, Felicity. When a pattern is observed, they rush to complete it in their own minds. But the pattern can be misleading. Sometimes the smallest detail, one that is easily overlooked, reveals more than the loudest suspicion." Felicity's eyes flickered briefly to the side table, where the silver case had once rested, now conspicuously absent. "I suppose you mean that trivial things often bear weight unseen," she said carefully. One must be cautious not to overestimate their importance. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver, and yet the small can be telling, especially when repeated. Patterns are formed not in grand gestures, but in the quiet consistencies of behavior. Felicity inclined her head slightly, her lips curved in the ghost of a smile. "I will take your words under advisement," she said, though Miss Marple detected a subtle tension in the set of her shoulders. It was the tension of someone accustomed to control, someone accustomed to managing the perceptions of those around her, yet aware that even the most careful control could falter. From Wyncombe House, Miss Marple moved to the Harwood cottage once more. Mrs. Harwood was tending her small garden, her movements deliberate but shaky. Clara's absence weighed heavily upon her, and Miss Marple could see it plainly in the furrow of her brow and the tight line of her mouth. "Mrs. Harwood," Miss Marple said gently, "you have been through much these past days. Tell me, you think Clara would have gone willingly, or could she have been persuaded or compelled to leave?" Mrs. Harwood looked up, her hands momentarily frozen in the soil. "I cannot imagine my Clara leaving on her own," she said, her voice trembling. She was careful, thoughtful. She feared nothing except what might harm another. If she is gone like this, I fear it is not by her choice. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, fear can be a powerful motivator, as can trust misplaced. People place their confidence where they ought not, and sometimes, even with the best intentions, danger follows. As she walked home that evening, Miss Marple reflected on the impressions she had gathered. Robert Wyncombe, frustrated but honest, in his fear, seemed increasingly unlikely to be guilty. Felicity Wyncombe, ever composed, ever in control, bore a tension that was telling in its subtlety. Clara Harwood's disappearance and death hinted at an external influence, someone who had been careful, deliberate, and capable of manipulating the circumstances to their advantage. At home, with her knitting in hand, Miss Marple began to arrange the puzzle pieces in her mind. She reviewed the small details, the silver case, the contrasting behavior of the suspects, the remarks, inadvertently, let slip in conversation. It was not dramatic evidence that would sway an inspector, but it was the very sort of subtlety Miss Marple excelled at noticing. Her next step, she realized, would be deliberate. She would speak with each suspect in a manner seemingly casual, yet designed to provoke, to draw out reactions and contradictions. The human mind, left to its own devices, reveals more in moments of discomfort than in hours of careful explanation. It was a delicate art, one Miss Marple had practiced over decades. She would not rush, she would not confront directly. Instead, she would use observation, inference, and gentle conversation to uncover the hidden truths. People she knew could rarely resist showing their own hand when they believed themselves unobserved, or when they assumed the observer was too harmless to be dangerous. By the end of the week, she had arranged a series of visits, casual calls that would appear merely social to the casual eye. Each encounter was designed to illuminate, to prod gently at nerves and consciences, to watch for the smallest quiver, the faintest hesitation. She would see who controlled themselves well and who faltered, and in those falters lay the key to the mystery. As she settled by her fire that night, knitting quietly, she reflected on the intricate dance she was about to perform. Death and deception had entered St. Mary Mead, threading through the lives of those she knew and loved. But the truth, she believed, could be discerned through patience, perception, and careful attention to human nature. And Miss Marple had both, the patience and the perception necessary to unravel it. The quiet of her sitting room was comforting, a contrast to the storm of suspicion raging outside. Yet even as she arranged her thoughts, she felt a thrill of anticipation. The next steps would be delicate, demanding careful observation and gentle provocation. The web was close to being revealed, and soon, she was certain, the truth would shine through the shadows. The morning was bright and crisp, the sun cutting through the lingering mist that clung to the village lanes. Birds chirped in the hedgerows, oblivious to the tension that hung over St. Mary Mead like a silent storm. The streets were quieter than usual, as though the villagers themselves hesitated to breathe too loudly, fearing that words might summon calamity. Miss Marple, however, moved with her usual deliberate pace. her eyes keenly observing the small signs of life that often revealed the inner workings of people's thoughts. Her plan for the day was simple, yet cunning in its execution. She would invite Felicity Wincombe to tea at her own home, ostensibly for a friendly chat, but in truth to create a situation where subtle observations might reveal more than any direct questioning ever could. The afternoon, she decided, would be her stage, and Felicity, unsuspecting and confident, her unwitting participant. Felicity arrived promptly, her black dress immaculate, her veil framing her face like a delicate mask. She smiled politely, and Miss Marple returned the smile with warmth that suggested nothing more than simple hospitality. They settled into the parlor, the fire burning gently, and Miss Marple poured tea with careful precision, maintaining an air of casual conversation. "My dear," she began softly, "the village has been so unsettled I thought it might do us both good to sit quietly and speak of anything but tragedy." She lifted her cup, pretending to sip, though her mind was fully engaged in her observations. Felicity nodded, appearing serene, though Miss Marple's practiced eyes noted the tiniest twitch at the corner of her mouth. "Yes, it is unsettling," Felicity agreed, her voice smooth, measured. "One cannot escape the gossip, no matter how one tries. People see shadows where none exist and find scandal in ordinary things." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, and yet sometimes shadows reveal more than they conceal. Do you not agree that small things, trifles even, can be revealing?" Felicity's hand hovered over her teacup for a moment longer than necessary. "Small things, perhaps, but trifles are hardly proof of anything. One must be cautious not to over-interpret." The older woman's eyes twinkled ever so slightly. "Oh, of course, Felicity, but it is remarkable the way people reveal themselves even when they believe they are concealed. The human mind is a curious thing. It will betray itself if observed carefully." Felicity's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the cup. She did not answer immediately, and Miss Marple seized the pause as an opportunity. "Do you remember Clara Harwood?" she asked softly, in a tone that suggested reminiscence rather than inquiry. Felicity's hand moved almost imperceptibly, brushing the edge of the teacup as if startled by the mention. I remember her," Felicity said, her composure intact, but Miss Marple detected the micro-expression of tension, an almost invisible tightening around the eyes. The reaction was subtle, but in Miss Marple's experience, subtle was often the truer indicator of the mind at work. Miss Marple continued, speaking in her gentle conversational manner. "Such a young woman. It was a tragedy, of course, what happened. I sometimes wonder if people realize how fragile life can be. Even the strongest can be taken unexpectedly." She paused, watching Felicity closely, noting every twitch, every small shift in posture. "Yes, it is tragic," Felicity said, her voice steady, yet Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her lips. "A shame for her family, certainly." Miss Marple nodded, placing her cup down deliberately. "And yet, Felicity, I cannot help but wonder how one small object, a trifle really, might hold the key to understanding. A silver case, for instance, so small and seemingly insignificant, yet it can carry consequences far beyond its size." Felicity's fingers faltered over her own teacup this time. Her composure remained, but her gaze flickered briefly to the corner of the room where a small decorative table sat. Miss Marple's eyes followed the motion, noting the faint tension in her shoulders. "Objects," she continued softly, "often betray the secrets people hope to conceal. A misplaced item, a hidden possession, such things tell a story that words alone cannot convey. Would you not agree?" Felicity's lips pressed together, her hands now clasped tightly. I suppose. But one must be careful not to read too much into innocent things." Miss Marple leaned back, smiling as though in idle contemplation. "Oh, certainly. But the mind is a curious creature. It seeks to hide and yet reveals, and when someone believes themselves clever, believing all their steps are measured and hidden, it is then they show themselves most clearly." Felicity sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on the cup. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, almost casual, but every minute movement of Felicity's hands, every slight tightening of her jaw, was catalogued in the older woman's mind. "Tell me, Felicity," Miss Marple said softly. "Have you noticed how often we attribute events to chance? Deaths, disappearances, misfortunes. We call them accidents, tragedies, misadventures. And yet, if one observes carefully, sometimes patterns emerge that are far too precise to be random." Felicity's hand shook ever so slightly as she set the cup down. Miss Marple's eyes met hers fully now, as if laying a quiet challenge. "Patterns, you say?" Felicity's voice was lower, guarded. I do not know what you mean." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Perhaps you do. Perhaps you are only too aware. The smallest detail can reveal the greatest truth. And the truth, Felicity, will always find a way to surface, despite all attempts to conceal it." The effect on Felicity was immediate, though it was not dramatic. She straightened in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to maintain control of her inner reactions. Yet Miss Marple had seen what she needed. The slight quiver of her hands, the brief flicker of unease in her gaze, the careful, measured breathing, all spoke of a mind not entirely at ease, a mind concealing more than it revealed. Miss Marple's voice softened, coaxing yet firm. "You have been so composed, Felicity, so careful. But one cannot maintain such perfection indefinitely. Eventually, even the most cunning must reveal. Something, sometimes by words, sometimes by gestures, sometimes by a single telling slip." Felicity's veil of calm began to falter, though she did not yet break. "Miss Marple, She paused, swallowing, her lips pressed tight. "I do not understand what you are suggesting." "That is natural," Miss Marple said gently, leaning back as if dismissing the importance of her words. "I only speak of patterns, of small things, of the inevitability of human nature, and as always, I watch and I wait." Felicity's eyes darted to the silver case now resting on the small side table, as if drawn despite herself. Miss Marple noted the moment, the involuntary glance, the tightening of fingers, the faint catch in the throat. It was enough. Enough. To know that Felicity's carefully constructed composure might yet be breached. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself, sipping her tea. She had placed her trap, subtle though it was. Now it remained only to observe, to watch for the next flicker, the next involuntary motion, the next sign that would betray the truth. The web of suspicion was narrowing, and the moment of revelation she knew was approaching. Outside, the village continued its quiet routine, unaware that in a small parlor, truth and deception were performing a delicate dance. Inside, Miss Marple sat serene, patient, and certain. The final act was near, and when it came, the story would be revealed in all its dark clarity. The sun had just begun its descent, casting a golden haze across the village of St. Mary Mead. The lanes glimmered with dampness, and the faint smell of smoke from the chimneys mingled with the earthy scent of late autumn leaves. Yet within the Wincombe drawing-room, the air was taut with anticipation, a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. Felicity Wincombe sat as usual, her composure flawless, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had been summoned by Miss Marple for tea, as had Robert Wincombe, and a few other villagers whose presence Miss Marple had insisted was necessary for the day's conclusion. Miss Marple, knitting needles paused in her lap, regarded her guests with calm precision. Every gesture, every inflection of voice, every subtle shift in posture had been catalogued over the past days and nights. The threads of suspicion, the clues, the hidden patterns, they were all here now, ready to be drawn together. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle yet imbued with authority. "It has been a trying time for our village, and especially for the Wincombe household. 2 deaths, a disappearance, and the general unease have left many questions unanswered. Perhaps now we can begin to make sense of what has occurred." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Felicity's eyes, however, remained steady, though a faint tension had begun to seep into her posture. Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational, masking the sharpness of her mind. "You see, it is often the smallest of details that reveal the largest truths. A word carelessly spoken, a gesture that betrays a thought or an object overlooked, can provide clarity when all else fails." She cast her eyes toward the silver case, which rested innocuously on the side table, its presence deliberate. Felicity's hand twitched ever so slightly, betraying the self-control she had maintained so meticulously. Miss Marple's eyes caught it immediately, though no one else noticed. Clara Harwood's death, Miss Marple continued, was a tragedy that shocked us all. Yet the circumstances surrounding it are not as random as some may believe. When one observes carefully, patterns emerge. Geoffrey Wincomb's death, Clara's disappearance, and ultimately her untimely end, these are connected, bound not by chance, but by design. A shiver passed through the room. Robert Wincombe, his face pale, leaned slightly forward. Felicity's hands rested tensely in her lap, her lips pressed in a thin line. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, "there was a certain object, a silver case, that travelled between hands. At first one might think it insignificant, merely a trifle, but trifle it was not. This case contained tablets, not harmful in themselves, but indicative of someone's planning and intent, and the one who moved it with such care, the one who ensured it was present at critical moments, is the same who orchestrated the events that have brought grief to this household." Felicity's eyes widened fractionally, a micro-expression of surprise swiftly concealed under her usual mask of calm. Miss Marple, as always, noted these slips. "The first death," she continued, "that of Sir Geoffrey Wincombe, seemed sudden, perhaps natural. Yet it occurred after the introduction of certain measures carefully calculated to induce a fatal episode, measures known to someone well versed in human frailty and familiar with the household's routines. Geoffrey's own behavior, trusting and unsuspecting, facilitated what was, in fact, a deliberate act." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "Clara Harwood," she went on, "possessed knowledge of these acts and for that reason became a threat to the orchestrator. Her disappearance and subsequent death were likewise planned with precision to remove a witness and maintain secrecy." The room remained silent, the only sound the gentle crackling of the fire. Felicity, seated rigidly, met Miss Marple's gaze with a controlled expression, yet the slight blanching of her skin betrayed her inner turmoil. "And so, the truth becomes clear," Miss Marple said, leaning forward ever so slightly. "It was not Robert Wincombe, though his temper made him an easy suspect. Nor was it anyone acting on impulse. It was the person who remained composed, who directed attention elsewhere, who manipulated appearances with subtlety and care." "Felicity, Wincombe, you orchestrated these events, ensuring each step appeared accidental, yet each was calculated to remove those who might interfere with your plans." Felicity's hands clenched briefly, hidden beneath her folded fingers. I don't understand," she murmured, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles poised as if still occupied. "It is very simple, my dear. The silver case, handled with such apparent innocence, was a key indicator. Its placement, its timing revealed patterns only one person could have foreseen. Geoffrey's death, Clara's knowledge, the quietness with which events were managed, all point to one mind controlling the circumstances, one mind calculating every step." The guests exchanged shocked glances. Robert's jaw tightened, relief and disbelief mingling in his expression. The others murmured, realizing that the careful accusations cast upon Robert had been misdirected, deliberate diversions from the true culprit. Felicity's veil of composure faltered just enough. Her eyes darted momentarily to the window, then back seeking escape, though no door could carry her from the truth that Miss Marple had unravelled. "You saw patterns," she whispered finally, almost to herself. "For you observed everything." Miss Marple's expression was gentle. "I observed enough, Felicity, to discern what is hidden by pride and pretense. People, even the cleverest, cannot conceal their actions entirely. Human nature is never fully masked. Fear, control, anticipation, and guilt all leave traces. I watch, I listen, and I see what others choose to ignore." Felicity's lips pressed together, a faint quiver running through her otherwise perfect composure. "And Clara?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "What of her knowledge? Could she have thwarted me?" "She tried in her own quiet way," Miss Marple replied, her voice unchanging. But she was not given the opportunity to act. And so the outcome was determined by the same hand that moved the case, that orchestrated the circumstances, that ensured control. Yet even with all this care a pattern emerged, one I could read. And patterns, my dear, never lie. The room was silent once more, the crackling of the fire now sounding ominous in the heavy quiet. Felicity Wincombe, realizing that all was revealed, sank slightly into her chair, her hands trembling now beyond concealment. Miss Marple's eyes, kind yet unyielding, did not waver. "And now, Felicity," Miss Marple said softly, "justice will take its course. The patterns are clear, the evidence unmistakable, and the truth cannot be altered. We have observed, we have waited, and now the consequences of these actions must be faced." The inspector, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his expression grave. Felicity, seeing the inevitability in his eyes and in Miss Marple's calm certainty, nodded faintly, her composure finally broken. She did not resist, nor did she speak further. The pattern had been revealed, and with it the quiet, unrelenting logic that Miss Marple had followed to its conclusion. As the guests departed, the village exhaled collectively, the tension that had bound them slowly easing. St. Mary Mead would continue its daily life, the milk deliveries, the children to school, the shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, but the shadow of recent events would linger, a reminder of the consequences hidden within human actions, and the subtlety with which a determined mind could shape events. Miss Marple, returning to her own quiet parlour, set her knitting aside. She looked out at the soft evening light, reflecting on the patterns she had observed and the truths she had uncovered. Human nature, she thought, was endlessly complex, deceptive and revealing in equal measure. Yet with patience and careful attention, even the most carefully orchestrated schemes could be unravelled. And so, with the village returning to its rhythm, Miss Marple reflected on the lesson that the past, present and human cunning were forever intertwined, leaving her, as always, quietly satisfied that the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, would inevitably emerge.